Thanks again. Next up, we have Dr. Jessica Lautz with the National Association of Realtors. She has incredible information about international buyers, insights into generational trends, profile of buyers and sellers, and a lot of excellent information. You're really going to enjoy this session. Welcome, Jessica. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much. I am super excited to be here. This is actually my first time in Miami, and I'm thrilled. I wish I could stay here longer. Maybe just never leave. I'll buy that house on the Caribbean. Okay, perfect. So I have a bunch of trends here. I made it into a top 10 list because let's make it fun. I'm going to jump around a little bit, but I'm super excited to talk about data first thing in the morning. I know you guys are all super excited to hear about data first thing in the morning. So here we go. All right. Number one, there's a lack of affordable housing inventory. If you just look on the Realtor.com app and you lay in bed in the hotel room and you're like, oh wow, I'm gonna live here forever, you realize that you can't live here forever because all the homes are over $1 million. So that's not gonna work out for me. But what we look and we see on a nationwide scale is that housing has become very unaffordable to a number of individuals, namely first-time home buyers, minorities, singles who are in the market, and I'm going to talk about some of that right now. When we look at the U.S. inventory, what we see is that we have about 4 months of supply, and that is give or take on a decimal point every month. And what we know is that in many markets, really, you have a day of supply, or you have 12 hours of supply, because as soon as a home goes on the market and it is affordable, that is gone immediately. What we also know is that we have 91 months of year-over-year price growth. That is unprecedented in the housing market. We've collected these data points back to the 1960s, and we've never seen this long of year-over-year home price growth. This is completely unprecedented. This is a market that we don't know because we have never had it before. The other thing that we know, we've been talking about forever, is this lack of first-time home buyers. And coming out of the recession, we haven't seen them. What we want in an even market is that 40% of buyers are first-time home buyers, and right now, just about a third. So we really just don't see them, and we see this very suppressed level today. What we also know is that we're short by 5 to 6 million homes. And this isn't an even distribution, because what we know is that on the very high end, the luxury market, those that have your own private elevator and they'll do your wash and fold laundry for you and make your bagel for you in the morning, those type of condos are available, right? We see those in many markets in the US. We see them here, we see them in DC, in New York, and Boston. In those beautiful markets, we see those types of condos available and those luxury properties. But what we don't see is your median priced bread and butter single family property that people typically buy, because that's the type of place where you can raise a family or have a dog or so on and so on. Those are the type of properties that we're missing. In fact, some builders are saying there's just no point in me building a property that's under $350,000. There's no market for it. No one will come and buy this property, which is fascinating because we know that there's buyers there for that. What we also see is that there's this huge push towards small towns and suburban areas because people seek out affordability. And they're doing so in different ways than they have in the past. When we look at our younger millennials today, what we actually see is that they're more likely to want to live close to friends and family than other generations have historically. And we see this push towards family and having this family unit around you. And I'm going to talk about some of the data where we actually see a lot of growth of moving out of family home and into homeownership. And it's really changing and it's shifting what we see in home buyers today. The other thing that we know is that there is a rise in income of successful home buyers. Those who can enter the market are just wealthier. And it doesn't matter if you're domestic or international, you are wealthier. You are able to buy a second home, you're able to buy a vacation property, and you're just more likely to have a higher household income. And your family has a higher household income if they're entering the market today as well. What that means is that the homeownership rate has retreated for many different individuals. And one of those, the biggest one that's probably talked about right now, is the homeownership rate for those who are under the age of 35. And when we see this, it's actually the lowest number that census has recorded back to 1982. And that's a problem, because it means that there's a lot of people doubling up. There's a lot of people who are missing out on this housing wealth, and the greatest way to build wealth in the US is through housing. It's not necessarily through savings, and we know that building a nest egg and having that equity in a home is a great way to do that for many Americans, but these Americans are being left out of that. And when we look at this by race, this has been talked about a lot recently. But when we look at the African American home ownership rate, something that's not necessarily talked about too much is that it's essentially unchanged from when the Fair Housing Act started. When it was legal to discriminate based on by race and housing, we essentially see the same home ownership rate for African Americans. And for Hispanic Americans, it has been ticking up in recent quarters. We have seen some growth overall as a nation, but not necessarily in the growth that we would want to see completely stable right now. It's been bouncing around quite a bit. All right, number 2, international buyers. So when we look at the international market, NAR has been doing a lot of research on this, and we can look at the international market on a nationwide scale, and what we see is that unfortunately it has declined. Over a 3-year period, we have seen declines. Now 2017 was a great year. We started seeing huge home price growth. We still had low interest rates, a lot of people jumping into the market and saying that this is a good investment for me. 2019, though, not as great. We have seen that fall off. Now, a lot of international buyers are paying all cash, and so as we see this unprecedented home price growth of 91 months, people say, oh, wow, I don't know. Maybe I'm going to take a step back. Maybe I'm not going to do this right now, as we do see this huge home price growth. There's a lot of other reasons behind that as well, and we collect them all within this research, but that's just one of many that is listed for realtors saying that they've seen a retreat. The other thing that we know is just the number of units in thousands has declined as well. So it's not just home price growth, it's not just the aggregate amount, we do just see the flat out number of units has retreated. Now the good thing is that Florida is strong, right? So we do see a lot of international buyers here. If you just look at the pool of the share, you're not gonna see them in as many states as much as you do in Florida. So Florida is very strong, Miami is strong. That is a good part of the market, but it is still a retreat overall. The other thing that we see is that there's a decline in purchase price. So as people are paying all cash, they're saying, I don't know, maybe I'm not necessarily going to buy that luxury unit, maybe I'm going to buy something else, but we see that decline in purchase price when we look at the international buyers today. What we do see is that the biggest decline in purchases is actually in China. So for Chinese buyers, they have retreated the most. That's the red line on the top, and you can see that huge steep decline. And so for this particular area here, maybe this is not impacting the market as much as it is in other areas on the West Coast, where you do see much more steep declines. What we see here is that there's still a strong buyer's market for international buyers, but there are individual countries where buyers are coming less than they had been historically. All right, number 3, buyers are swiping left on love. So I'm gonna go back to the domestic market, and when we look at this, what we can see is that it's very interesting because the marriage rates in the US have actually plummeted. What we used to see is back in the 1960s, more than 70% of American adults were married. And today, just half are married. People aren't getting married as much as they used to. Maybe they're deciding to step away from marriage, or maybe they're just never getting married in the first place. And we see that this is really interesting when we look at the dynamic of home buyers today, because it's changing the dynamics of who can afford a home, what they need in a home, how much space they need. And what we see is, especially for our first-time home buyers today, there's a massive retreat in those who are purchasing homes as first-time home buyers as a married couple. We used to see back in the 1980s that 75% of home buyers who are first-time home buyers were actually married, and today it's just a little over half. I'll tell you the latest, greatest data is coming out next week, and this trend just continues. The huge growth that we've seen is, yes, in single females. We've been talking about that for a very long period of time, but with housing affordability where it is, it's really difficult for that single female who traditionally has lower income and on one salary to enter the home buying market. Growth points that we are seeing, unmarried couples, really interesting. The highest number that we have seen, unprecedented amount of unmarried home buyers purchasing homes together. So making the biggest financial purchase of their life without a wedding ring, okay? no judgment call, all right. The other part that we're seeing this huge growth on is roommates. So those who are the Golden Girls phenomenon, two unmarried, unromantic partners saying, I am tired of renting, I want more space, let's go purchase a home together. And this is a really exciting point that we're seeing this unprecedented growth on. Now this is really exciting too because we're actually seeing it in vacation properties and investment properties where they're saying, maybe I'll still rent my primary residence, but go in and purchase a vacation property with a friend. So we're seeing growth on all spectrums of this, which is really interesting. The other growth point is single males. We haven't historically talked about them in the home buying market, but we're actually seeing growth points there. And it's really interesting because as they go to purchase their home, they're actually more likely today to say, hey, this is a better investment for me than stocks. It's a good financial investment, and that's a growth point in the market. And it's a difference from what it has been historically. The other thing that we see is that the age of our first-time home buyers is essentially unchanged. We're not really seeing big changes there. And the reason why is they're wealthier, they have more money, they have more family money going into that home purchase. But this change that we're seeing is really fascinating to me. This is the age of our repeat buyers. It used to be in the mid-30s. Today it's in the mid-50s. That is flooring. Like, that just completely stuns me as a data point because what it means is that someone is taking on a 30-year fixed mortgage in their mid-50s, looking down the road maybe 10 years, 15 years, if you're a realtor, 100 years towards retirement because realtors never retire. And we really do see this huge shift. And they're buying this home for different reasons than they have historically. They're purchasing this home with family members in mind. They're purchasing this home for kids over the age of 18, under the age of 18, aging parents in their home, and they're planning on working and living longer and happy to take on this mortgage at this point. The other thing that we see, number 3, is that caretaking now needs a lint brush. This is a fascinating trend to me. So in the US, we have more than a 30-year low in birth rates today. People are not having children how they used to in an unprecedented amount. But interestingly, what we also see is that the actual number of people living in a house, the number of people living in a house has increased for the first time in 160 years. That stat blew my mind. And it really means that people are living in different ways in their homes. Now, one of the ways that they're living is they have pets there, but the other way is that there's more adults living in this home as well. And so we see more multi-generational living. We see more taking care of other family members in a way that we haven't historically. But when we look at home buyers today and we say, okay, how many children are in the home? What we actually see is that it's dropped considerably. Back in 1985, 58% of families had children under the age of 18 in their home, and today just 34% do. That's a huge shift. It's a huge shift in neighborhood preferences too, and in space that's wanted in that home. So maybe you don't need that extra bedroom because you don't have children. Maybe you don't necessarily care about where that school district is because you don't have children that you have or that you plan on having in that home. That's a really big shift in neighborhood preferences. It's a really big shift in what people want out of their home. One of the other changes that we're seeing too is that people are investing more in pets. Absolutely, 100%, they are throwing their money there. There's Fitbits for dogs. There's dog houses with solar panels. There are all kinds of cameras and watching so that you can watch your pet when you leave your house and just have a camera devoted to your pet. So these are the pets who live in my house. I actually should add another one because now we have 2 more kittens. Why? I don't know. They adopted my husband at a shelter yoga class, and now we have 2 more. Here we are. Yes. So when we look at this, what we see is that it's really unprecedented. This is a little tongue-in-cheek, right? Because these are the pets in my life and it makes me happy, but we're really seeing this as a driver today towards what it means and why you want to buy a house and the actual push and the drive to go and buy that property, but also where you're buying that property. Right now, I'm going to give you a sneak peek on data, and hopefully we won't broadcast this too much, but for unmarried couples and for other people as well that I won't say, like single females, we are actually seeing that it's more important to them to have their pet preferences in mind, size of the yard, where the dog park is, than the quality and the distance to schools. That should be shocking because it's an unmarried couple. Maybe one day you're going to have a junior in the house that you're going to care about that school, but it really is not mattering as much today as that four-legged fur baby that you're going to spend all your money on. So it's a fascinating change. All right, number 5, student loan debt is crushing finances. So now I'm going to take it way down to a really depressing point. Okay. Here we are. So it's increased 150% student loan debt in the last decade, and it's an unprecedented amount of debt. And it hasn't retreated. It's the only debt that hasn't actually retreated since the recession. Everyone else deleveraged. They didn't want to take on car loans. They didn't want to take on credit card debt, but student loans, you're investing in yourself. What we've also seen is that people talk about it as this millennial issue, but what we actually see is that when we look at those who are over the age of 55, their student loan debt increased 1,250% in the last 10 years. That is incredible. That is a lot of money going towards student loans. And the other thing that we know, being in the housing industry, we know about negative amortization loans, we know about risky loan products, and student loans really are that right now. For 47% of people, so about half of people who have student loan debt, who are making on-time payments, making their payment every month, they owe more the next quarter than they do right now. That is really scary. That has some really big implications for what we talk about this, because it really damages their credit, it damages their debt-to-income ratio, and it damages their ability to buy a home. And that's the number one thing that student loan debt holders want to do, if they had that available cash, is to save for a down payment and purchase a home. When we look at just the millennial generation, and we look at just these young adults who do have the highest dollar amount of debt, what we see is that their household saving or their household income is actually lower than what their student loan debt amount is. And if you look at different markets, this is completely different. Essentially, in the DC area, you just add zeros onto this. Maybe not just like that, but what you do see is that about half of people in the DC area, about half of people in sections of Colorado actually have a bachelor's degree. And so when you look at that, you see that there's a higher share of people with student loan debt, they have higher earnings, but you're just adding on the amount of debt that they have. What we know is that 80% of student loan debt holders are not owners today. And they do want to be owners. They absolutely want to enter the housing market, and they just feel like they can't get there today. And the main reason they say that is because of their student loan debt, and they expect their delay to be 7 years. Now, I'll say that I set the table with all this housing affordability and the lack of inventory, and when we look at this, that 7 years might be a little optimistic, because they're assuming that there's going to be a house available for them in that time period when they actually go to purchase. We also wanted to know, okay, who has student loan debt, is a homeowner, and actually can't move because of their debt? And what we found is there's a large section of Americans in that situation. And when we expand this to all generations, it actually gets about a third. Right now, it's 28% for millennials. And they expect their delay to be 3 years before they can move out of that situation. So really a big problem here. Number 6. The bank of mom and dad. What we know, though, is that there are first-time home buyers out there. What we know is that there are young buyers out there, and we know that a lot of them have student loan debt, inching towards half. And when we look at this, what we know is that they're getting there somehow, and maybe it's not on their own finances. Maybe it's not on their own household income. Maybe it's somewhere else. And so we have seen this unprecedented amount of growth in those who have mom and dad's help. So my little sister is 26 years old, lives in my basement. So because she lives in my basement, I get to tell every story that I want about her because she lives in my basement. Okay. So I also get to tell them about her friends because they are at my house all the time. So her best friend, Kelly, recently got married, and her dad gave a very generous gift of down payment help and a gift as a wedding gift to go and purchase a house. And she Facebook messaged me and she said, hey, I want to know about low down payment programs for first-time home buyers. What first-time home buyer programs are available in this market? And I live in the Arlington area. It's where Amazon HQ2 is coming. That's really exciting for jobs, and that is really awful if you want to buy a home. Because overnight our housing market changed, completely overnight. You suddenly had inventory and then you didn't, completely. And in my zip code, there was about 40 homes for sale, and now there's about 2 at any given time. There's just no homes in that market anymore. And so, 1, I laughed into my phone and said, good luck, Kelly, you're never buying a home. And 2, I said, I don't know. I don't know about first-time homebuyer programs. I don't know about these that could be available. Do you have a realtor? Yes. My realtor doesn't know much about it. Okay, Kelly, do you have a mortgage broker? Yes, but my mortgage broker doesn't know much about it. And both of those things made me wince, because even if you are a first-time home buyer and you have this assistance, you may just look at other programs too, right? Maybe you want to take advantage of any programs that are out there. So I sent her to HUD.gov, which is the worst resource I could possibly do, because I know nothing on a local level that could help her. So I would just encourage to make sure that everyone in your office, as a broker or an owner or a realtor, just knows about these programs that could be out there for first-time home buyers. When we look at this help, what we see is 1/3 of first-time home buyers have down payment assistance from friends or family. And this is a huge growth. We have absolutely seen that people are not only gifting money, they're loaning money, and this is the way that people are entering homeownership. And it makes everyone's job really hard, because now everyone's opinion is counted in this, right? Because now mom and dad matter, and the in-laws matter, and the stepmom matters, and so on in this home purchase. What we also see is that there's a lot of people who are doing what my sister's doing and living at home trying to save money. Now, I'm pretty sure she saves no money, and she won't tell me how much is in her savings account, because I think it goes to the Uber driver every weekend, and it does not actually go to a savings account to buy a home, so she's going to live there forever. That's fine. So what we see is that there's about double the share who are living at home and moving directly from a home situation with family into homeownership. That is an unprecedented change. And that is something that we're really seeing. And that changes and shifts the preferences of where people are actually moving as well. Because suddenly living down the street, living in that suburban area becomes a very attractive way to live for your first home. We also see that multi-generational homes are on the rise. And it used to just be a baby boomer thing, and we used to think of this as a baby boomer generation, and this was just the sandwich generation who would just have this, and this wouldn't necessarily keep going and increasing. But what we actually see is that 1 in 6 Gen Xers purchased a multi-generational home last year. Somewhere where not just they will have aging children who aren't going to leave, but also aging parents, or a place for them to live there as well. And we also see that there is this huge section that's actually growing, and they're doing this for cost savings. They're all contributing to this mortgage, and they're all thinking, this is somewhere where I want to live for a longer period of time, this is a bigger house, and this will give me a place where I can do that. Number 7, the bar has risen on buyer expectations. Absolutely. And when you're buying a house with someone else's money, then your expectations are incredibly higher, right? If I was going to give this slide a subtitle, it would be HGTV is ruining my life. Because this is what we have heard so much from realtors, is that HGTV has completely risen the bar on expectations as buyers go into the home. They expect something different, and what they expect is that 65% of members cited a portion of buyers expect homes to look like TV shows when they go into them. And this becomes really important too, not just for domestic people, but for someone who's moving internationally who has very high expectations of what this home is going to look like, what this neighborhood is going to look like, because all you've seen are the photos, and you're relying on this expectation. We also see that 71% of members cited a portion of buyers are disappointed that real homes don't look like TV shows. Interesting, okay. We also found in this report that 60% of my members cited a portion of buyers consult friends and family for advice and not actually their realtor. So picking up the phone and being Kelly, or Facebook messaging and being her, as opposed to consulting your realtor for the advice that they obviously have and want to give you. And there is that fear of reaching out, that fear of doing these first steps, which is really interesting in that transaction as well. One of the ways that we are thinking about this whole idea of HGTV and this whole idea of expectations is just home staging. And so we've seen this growth in this industry where nearly 40% of members have actually changed their business plan because of the rise in home staging and the rise in expectations. And we see that staging, absolutely, you sell your home faster, you sell it for more money, you actually have a very shiny picture that looks great with lots of light coming in, as opposed to something where perhaps would not attract as many buyers as quickly. Number 8, tenure is longer. And I put these two things back to back on purpose because what we see is that tenure has increased dramatically in the US. And what we see is that people are not moving. Maybe they were underwater in their home, or they locked in those low interest rates, or they refied into those low interest rates. They're holding onto their property longer. They're remodeling their property to be a different type of property than they originally intended. Rooms are different than what they originally intended when they moved in, but they're staying there and they're staying put. And what we've seen is that tenure that used to be 6-7 years has now elevated all the way up to 9 to 10. And it's staying put, it's not retreating. We really do see it stuck there, and we don't see any sign of this changing. And what that means is that in keeping those relationships opening and building those relationships for referrals and repeat clients, you have to do that for a longer period of time. And it very much can be something that could be very frustrating as you go through and you talk to a seller who's held on to that property for a long period of time, and they remodeled that kitchen back in the 1990s, and doesn't it look great, but it really needs to be updated now. That can be a very frustrating point. So we have this whole report series on remodeling, and we talk about how much money are you going to recoup from doing a project so that you can actually talk to the seller about dollars and cents. But then we also have this whole section of the report that looks at remodeling in the buyer's perspective and the homeowner's perspective of how much joy you actually have once you take on that project as well. Number 9, budding issues. Yes, that is a marijuana leaf. Yes, okay. So we see in many states around the US right now that marijuana is now legal. And it's changing the real estate industry. It's changing business today. And we absolutely see that this is a very interesting dynamic because for commercial members, there's an opportunity there. Because if you have marijuana legal within the state, you grow the marijuana within the state, you harvest it, you store it, you sell it, and that's all business within the state. And that's all commercial business as well. And when you look at the residential side, there are of course some challenges because some state laws, like Alaska, actually allow nearly double-digit plants per person in the house. So suddenly you have a grow house if those are your state laws. It's very interesting. And so we're looking at this as an issue as well. When we see this, what we have actually seen from our commercial members is that there is a growth. There is a growth in demand for warehouses, land, and storefronts. And this is last year's data. We'll have the newest report out in November. But this is an interesting shift because, sure, it's a moral question. But if you just look at this from a dollars question, it is a very interesting change that we're seeing. What we have seen on the residential side is that the challenges are there. Absolutely. We see that a third of property managers have actually added addendums to leases because it becomes a fair housing issue. Can you smoke in the property? And if you smoke, what damage could you be creating? And can you allow no smoking addendums in that property as well? So our policy folks are working on this, and they're working on it from that fair housing perspective. Perhaps you only allow other ways of having marijuana in that property, and is that qualifying for fair housing laws? We've also seen that once people do move, of course, the smell and the moisture stay in the property, especially if they're growing. And we have seen this on the commercial side as well. And then it opens up this whole other can of worms of, are you okay taking cash? Can you take cash for rent? Can you take cash for commercial properties? Because it's an all-cash business. And in Colorado, they've opened up entire banks to actually deal with this that can actually take cash. All right, number 10, greenhouses. So we talk about sustainability a lot as a very pressing issue, and it does become a very passionate issue for a lot of people. And what we see is really fascinating. So we've done quite a bit of research on this, and we have an entire sustainability report. And what we've actually seen is it's really difficult to find that green home. It's very difficult for people who do feel passionately and want to reduce their footprint because it is difficult to find a property in your price point already. So what we've seen is that these kinds of ideas are really heading back to each other. Half of members find buyers are interested in a sustainable home. They do want a greener home than perhaps they're currently living in or renting. But what we do see is that if you're colorblind, you will not be able to see this at all. So I'll walk you through this, sorry about that. The top one is 2018 data, and the bottom bar is 2008 data. And essentially what we've seen over time is this retreat in buyers actually ranking that energy efficiency is very important in that property, which is fascinating because if we think in the last decade, it's become such a bigger issue bubbling up. It's become such a more important issue to so many people, and so it's very interesting to see this retreat. Number one, though, consistently is heating and cooling costs. People think about their own pocketbook at the end of the month. And when you think about the lack of cash and wages being outpaced considerably by home prices, it really does matter at the end of the month how much your utilities are. How much are you going to be paying for that out of it? And so we start thinking about things like public transportation as well, and home prices going up considerably in areas where there's public transportation and ways to get around. We've been adding onto this list things that are growing here as issues like public transportation, like walkability. That data will be out soon too. And we do see that there are some differences. So when we look in urban areas, suddenly these things become very, very important to buyers going into those homes. Not surprising. Looking at that remodeling and thinking about that, what we do see is that people take on projects because they want to think about sustainable efforts. And so once you're in that home, once you find that perfect home, even if it is dated, you want to think about insulation and your HVAC unit and your heat pump and looking at new front doors and windows for sustainability, looking at durable products, not just remodeling because they need to, but remodeling because why not throw in that extra dollars so that you do have a more sustainable project as well. All right, number 11, agent is trusted. So what we see on a nationwide scale is that absolutely, people want to use an agent in that transaction. They do not want to go through the largest purchase of their life, their financial purchase, and the emotional energy purchase with someone who is not an agent without representation. And there's this huge shift in America as well towards thinking about things like going from an online store, like where you're going to purchase your eyeglasses from Warby Parker, to bricks. So from going from clicks to bricks. And we do see this transition because people are perhaps measuring their pupil distance and they're like, oh my God, I can't do this. If you guys have eyeglasses and you tried to do that, it's very difficult. Had a ruler up to my forehead forever, then walked around, had other people measure my pupil distance, had my husband do it 3 times over, had my sister do it because I didn't trust him. So, you know, you do these things, but perhaps I could have just gotten in my car, gone to the store, actually had that measured, and that would have been a lot easier. And now there's suddenly Warby Parkers who have popped up everywhere. So we do see this huge shift, right? A shift towards wanting to feel the clothes and actually touch them, and maybe when you go return, then you pick up 2 more things. Doesn't happen, right? But we all do it. So we do see this huge shift towards going towards this really personal experience where you are treated like this valuable person as opposed to just doing everything online. And there used to be this huge fear, and I think there still is, of this huge millennial generation. We don't know anything about them. But truthfully, they're the largest adult generation out there today, and they're the largest generation with huge buying power. And so I think there's perhaps less fear as we break down those barriers today. When we do look at agent use, what we see is both on the buyer side and the seller side, it's on unprecedented levels. And I think it's an interesting dynamic too, because when we look and we think about this fear of perhaps even Gen Z, the younger generation coming after millennials, we think, oh no, maybe they're just gonna do everything online. But that's going up against the thought that 1 in 10 millennial parents have called a boss and actually yelled at the boss to treat the kid better at work. So these 2 things are butting up against them. And we see that they have snowplow parents, they have hovercraft parents, helicopter parents who have always been around them and will help them in that job interview and maybe go sit in the Silicon Valley waiting room while their kid's in the interview and then call the boss. So through every step of their process and every step of their life. And what we see for all generations is that millennials actually use agents at the highest rate of anyone else, and then Gen Z is a little lower, and then boomers are a little lower. And the only reason why it's a little lower is that boomers are purchasing more through builders than other generations because they have more money on the table to be able to do that. Not a huge surprise. So looking at the numbers, what we do see is that buyers' use of agents is near historical highs, and I'll tell you for the data next week, it gets even better. So we are seeing a lot of really encouraging information when we look at this. Number one thing that buyers want is really just to help them through that process find that right home to purchase. I think when we think about tenure too, it's really interesting because as people stay in their homes longer, first-time home buyers are first-time buyers, right? That's not a question. But repeat buyers now are essentially first-time home buyers. They haven't done this in the last decade. They don't know what they're doing. And as they go through this process, it's a completely different process today as what it has been historically. And so they need help in a way that what we're seeing in the data has them actually very close to what a first-time home buyer is, in a way that we haven't seen historically. Every step of that process, they want your help in a much more dependent way on the realtor. What we see on the selling side is that FSBOs are actually at an all-time low. It's only 7% in the last year. That is the lowest share we have ever recorded in the data, and it's very fascinating to see this change. And it's interesting because when we look at this, we can see that the agent use is absolutely trusted. People don't want to leave money on the table, and they don't know what they're doing during that process. They don't know how to market their home. They don't know how to price it competitively. And if they've been in their home for longer than they wanted to because they were underwater, because their tenure did increase for that long period of time, they want to do it in their time frame, and they want to do it quickly. And that is a change that we're seeing as well, is that people are really saying that this is the most important time. I'll say on the seller side, a change that we're seeing in the data that I have never seen before since we've collected this, is that sellers want to move closer to friends and family, and they want to be near that family. They want it near them. And I think this is interesting on the selling side, because it's not necessarily a job move, it's not necessarily a school move, it's a family move, but they're still saying selling within that time frame is really important to me. And that's a huge change in the data. That's something we've collected that data point back to 2005, and it's a big shift. So it's something that's interesting there. The last thing on the seller side that I'll say is that that idea of those expectations increasing, and the idea that your home has to be this shiny object with the perfect gray paint and the perfect color granite and the perfect stainless steel appliances to attract a buyer into it, sellers get it. And they get it in a way that the other thing that we're seeing is that the importance for sellers to have that realtor, that real estate agent, fix up that home for sale, tell them what they need to fix up, they get it. And it's the top three of what they want their agent to do for them today. And that's a big shift. All right, that's what I have for prepared remarks. I want to thank you guys so much for having me to this beautiful area. Thank you.